Thank you. And thanks to Novella. Novella is the coordinator of the night program and a lot to do with getting the word out about this event and providing the hospitality. It's kind of an interesting mix of people we have. The way it's going to work is I'm going to introduce Percy, and he's going to talk for a while and tell his story. And then Ignacio Chapela and I are going to ask him a couple questions and then throw it open to you for your questions. But in both Ignacio and Percy, we have two very interesting, unlikely, accidental actors in the now 10-decade-long drama surrounding genetically modified crops. Both have been involved with stories of contamination or gene flow, depending on how you want to characterize it. And in Ignacio's case, and perhaps we'll hear more about it later, in analyzing the contamination of traditional maize crops in Oaxaca with GMO constructs, and something the industry was not eager to sue farmers about. And then in the case of Percy, a farmer whose crops were contaminated also by GMO constructs, who found himself in a very long battle. Percy got himself caught up in the gears of the machinery of the GMO industry and Monsanto in particular in the year 1997, when Monsanto accused him of stealing its intellectual property, specifically the genes of its Roundup-ready canola. Percy is a canola farmer from Saskatchewan, probably the most famous canola farmer in the world, now or at any time in the past. Under circumstances that are still somewhat mysterious, Monsanto's patented genes wound up in his fields. There were canola plants that had been genetically engineered by Monsanto, or their parents had been, that came up in his fields. And when this came to the attention of Monsanto, they took action against him. They took legal action. This in itself is not so unusual. A great many farmers, we don't know exactly how many because these procedures are kept secret, have been sued or other actions brought against them, threats by Monsanto to enforce their intellectual property rights. Most of these farmers, I think it's safe to say, have gone quietly, have signed settlements. Many of those settlements include clauses that prohibit them from ever talking about what happened. So there is a secret history to the enforcement of patent rights with GMOs that we really don't know. Only Monsanto really knows how many farmers have been caught up in this process and what's happened to them and how much money they paid when they found themselves in this position. In Schmeiser, however, the company got more than they bargained for. Percy decided to fight, and he fought Monsanto all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court. And he'll tell us a little bit about that battle. And though he lost ultimately in that court in a 5-4 decision, which held that regardless of how those genes got into his fields, whether he planted them or whether they drifted or whether they blew off a truck or whatever it was, he was responsible. And therefore he owed Monsanto for the use of their intellectual property. He has nevertheless continued his fight, and he'll tell you about some of the latest chapters and continuing skirmishes, fighting on behalf of the sovereignty of farmers and the right to save seeds. Most recently, and I hope he'll tell us about this a little bit, Monsanto's genes have reappeared in his fields, and he has asked that Monsanto remove them, kind of throwing the ball back in their court. Monsanto has agreed to do this only if he will sign one of these gag clauses and not talk about it, and he's refused to do that. His almost now 10-year-long battle has thrown some very important issues into sharp relief. Who will be responsible for genes that end up where they haven't been planted? How do we distinguish between theft of intellectual property and the contamination or biological pollution of a farmer's field? To what lengths are companies like Monsanto going to enforce their intellectual property rights? And what are the implications for farmers and the age-old practice of seed saving of this new generation of patented seeds. So please help me warmly welcome Percy Schmeiser.
Thanks for the very kind introduction, and it's just great to be back here in Berkeley, and also great to be back in California. Sunny California, but coming from Reno over to Sacramento, it was not so sunny. It was a snowstorm. I had to put chains on. And I said to the officials, "Oh my God, I drive 6 months of the year in roads like this. Why do I have to put chains on?" But they wouldn't let me through until I put chains on. Anyway, I think there's a lot has happened since Monsanto issued that lawsuit against my wife and myself back in 1998, and the whole issue of GMOs, genetic modified organisms. And I think I'd like to go back just briefly to, for some of you that don't know my case. It was a patent infringement case, but what was not mentioned was that my wife and I were seed developers in canola, or rapeseed, or Rops as you call it in German, and for over 50 years. And we really feel even today that was one of the reasons that Monsanto came after us, is to try and obtain our seed stocks. And every day that goes by, there's more evidence of that. So we were seed developers, and canola farmers every year around the world used their seeds from year to year and developed their own seeds to suit their local climatic and soil conditions. We were developing canola that was suitable for our region east of Saskatoon, in the central part of Saskatchewan, about 100 or 200 miles north of the Montana border. Many of the seeds and plants were not done as well in Alberta or Montana, but they were suitable for our regions. So that gives you a background of what we were doing. Sure, we grew other crops, wheat and barley and oats, and also did some experimenting and development in peas and mustard. When Monsanto laid that lawsuit in 1998, it was a complete surprise to us. We had never gone to a Monsanto meeting. We didn't even know anybody from Monsanto. And we were very concerned when that lawsuit arose, and we didn't even know what it was all about, because there was very little information that there was even a patent on a gene or patent on a seed or plant that you could incorporate into a seed. So it was a real surprise. And we stood up to Monsanto at the time and said, if you have any of your GMOs, we didn't even know what GMOs were at that time, in our seeds and plants, and you should be guilty. There should be a liability issue for destroying our research and development of 50 years. Patent laws in most countries of the world, including our two countries, US and Canada, come under federal jurisdiction. And we had no choice of where the case would be heard. Federal Court of Canada with one judge. And today when I look back, how often we wished we could have had a judge and jury with farmers on that knew and understood farming, but that was not to be. So 2 years of pre-trial. And in that 2 years of pre-trial, Monsanto withdrew all allegations that we had ever obtained their seed illegally. But they said it didn't matter. The fact that there was some seeds or canola plants in the ditch, not even in our field, along one of our fields, we violated their patent. So that's the basis it went to Federal Court of Canada. Patent infringement because they found some of their canola plants, a few, in the ditch along one of our fields. So after 2.5 weeks of trial in the year 2000, what did the trial judge rule? And what he ruled is what made my case become internationally known overnight. He ruled it does not matter how Monsanto's genes get into any farmer's fields, seeds, or plants. And he went on to specify, the trial judge went on to specify how this could happen. Cross-pollination, direct seed movement by seeds blown in the wind, birds, bees, animals, floods, etc. And he went on to say that if that happens, whether you're an organic farmer or a conventional farmer, you no longer own your seeds or plants, they become Monsanto's ownership. So overnight, all our research and development, all our seeds and plants became Monsanto's ownership. Right of contamination does not matter. He also ruled. If it's 1% or 2% or 10%, it didn't matter. So that was a real concern to us. So what do we do next? We then applied to the Federal Court of Appeal, and after 6 months, we were fortunate they granted us leave for appeal that we could go to the Federal Court of Appeal. Now we got 3 judges. They basically upheld all of the trial judge's decision, even though they did not agree with all of his rulings. And it should have been thrown out of court at that time. So we, after 4 years now of legal battle, then we had 2 losses. And it was pretty dim at that time. We had spent probably $300,000 in legal bills. We had taken out mortgages on our land to pay our legal bills, and so on. So the final avenue was the Supreme Court of Canada. But we had to apply for leave for appeal, and our chances were very slim for the Supreme Court of Canada to hear it because we had lost the 2 previous, the trial judge and the Federal Court of Appeal. And it was the best news in our life for my wife and myself when the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that they would hear the case. Now, when the Supreme Court decided to hear the case, we had other items that we could bring forward to the Supreme Court besides the patent infringement case which we were charged with by Monsanto. And I think it's very important, some of those issues that we were able to bring forward to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I will list you some of those other items we were able to bring to the Supreme Court. Number 1, can living organisms, seeds, plants, genes, human organs be owned and protected by corporate patents on intellectual property? Number 2, can genetic modified traits invade or become noxious weeds that then become resistant to weed killers? We now have them on the northern plains and the prairies of Western Canada, which we call super weeds. Number 3, can farmers' right to grow conventional or organic crops be protected? And number 4, can farmers keep the ancient right to save and use their seed from year to year and develop their seeds from year to year if they so desire? And number 5, the one that became very important to my wife and myself at that time, is that who owns life? Has anyone the right to put a patent on a gene to control life? In other words, no one should have that right, whether it's an individual or a corporation in this case. So those are the items that were really presented to the Supreme Court. What did the Supreme Court rule? First of all, in my case with the patent infringement, they ruled that, as was mentioned, we didn't have to pay Monsanto 1 red cent. But what was not fair, the Supreme Court ruled that we each have to pay our own legal costs. Monsanto has to pay their own legal costs right up from the beginning, from the trial judge, and we have to. Monsanto's costs are probably in the neighborhood of $2 million because at one time they had 19 lawyers in court, we had 1 lawyer. My legal cost, my wife's legal cost was over $400,000, which we had to pay. Now it's a lot easier for a multi-billion-dollar corporation to pay $2 million in court fees for a case what they said was a test case for them to see how far they could exercise the rights or patent law over farmers' rights. Then for a farmer to stand up for his rights and pay $400,000. So that was not right. Now, what about the issue of who owns life and all the other issues? This is what the Supreme Court of Canada ruled. They said Monsanto's patent on a gene is valid. And wherever that gene arrives in any higher life form, Monsanto owns and controls that higher life form. Now think of the implications of that. A higher life form, seed plant, goes through all the human life, animals, birds, bees, fish, and all, as I said, ends up in human life. So does that say if a gene comes into you, into your body by whatever means, whether it's breast cancer treatment or whatever, do they own you? Do they own me? The Supreme Court also went on to say this issue should never have come to the Supreme Court. It should have been addressed years before by the Parliament of Canada, and they directed the Parliament of Canada to readdress the issue. So that is what is happening, or where it stands now. The Parliament of Canada, or the people of Canada, now have to decide who owns life. Life is precious, and no one should have the right to control it. But in their, maybe in their wisdom, how they rule, Monsanto owns and controls that gene. Which means that if you put it into the environment, and Monsanto puts it into the environment, and it spreads by cross-pollination, direct seed movement, they cannot control it, so now we have a liability issue. And that's where Monsanto and all the other corporations are going to be brought down on, is on the liability issue. You can own and have a patent on the most deadly poison on the face of the earth that doesn't give you the right to put it into the environment where it kills people or it destroys human health. And that's where the case really stands. Now, what has happened since the Supreme Court ruling? On May 1st of this year, my case was presented to the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva. And Canada is being charged with drastic violations of human rights with the introduction of GMOs. Some of the areas of drastic violation is this. We don't have labeling in North America, and we don't have labeling in Canada. People don't know what they're eating. We don't know what we're feeding to our children or our grandchildren, and we should have the right to know that. European Union has it, as well as many other countries in the world. We should have the right to know. So that is a drastic violation of our rights, and that is what Canada is being charged at the present time. Another issue that was brought before the United Nations Human Rights Commission is that our academic community is a drastic violation towards them, because they're not allowed in many cases to express their findings or show what their findings are, especially if they're negative findings against GMOs or corporations. So that again is a drastic violation of our academic community. There was other items that we brought forward to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. There has been no report back from the Canadian government of the charges against them. So that's where it stands now in regards to my case. My wife and I tried to bring it as far as we could in regards under the legal system. Now, what has happened in the last year, as was mentioned? First of all, we have rented most of our land out, but we still farm, my wife and I still farm a quarter section, 160 acres, which is a very small parcel of land, you know, compared maybe to California here, but not on the prairies or the Western Plains. And we were going to do more mustard research, but last October, we noticed that there were canola plants growing on this land that had no crop put in, because we wanted to make it sure that this year it would be free of weeds. And we notified Monsanto because we suspected it was their GMO canola. There was no canola grown in that land for at least 6 or 7 years. Monsanto indeed sent 2 of their representatives out, and 2 days later they confirmed it was their GMO canola in our land again. So they said, what do we want to do? And I said, I want those things out of our land. We don't want GMO canola. And they said, okay, we will remove it by hand from 50 acres of land. We will remove these plants by hand. I said, fine, that's what I want to have done. But then they went on to say, oh, by the way, you have to sign a release form. And I said, what do you mean a release form? I said, because in the federal courts, all the way to the Supreme Court, said all a farmer has to do is notify you and they'll remove any GMO plants. They said, yeah, that's right. But we treat all farmers the same. They said, you have to sign a release form that you can never, your wife and yourself, or any member of your family can ever take Monsanto for the rest of your life ever to court again. And then also, if you have contamination next year, you have to be responsible yourself for it and remove the offending plants or spray or do whatever. But what really turned us off when they said also, you're not allowed, it was a gag order, to tell anyone or go to the press or speak about Monsanto again or tell them what the terms of the settlement were. So you can imagine what my wife and I told them. But anyway, they refused to remove those plants unless we signed the release. And we said, no way. So I didn't want those canola plants on our land, so I hired 2 of my neighbors to help me, and we removed the plants by hand and we had over 3 large truckloads. And we notified Monsanto the days that we were doing this, and after it was done, we notified Monsanto they are on a large pile. What do you want done with them? They said, we will do nothing unless you sign a release. I said, okay, I have 3 options. I can burn them, I can haul them to your head office in Saskatoon and dump them on your doorstep, or take them to Winnipeg and do it on your head office in Manitoba. So they refused to do that. So then the cost to remove these plants, I paid to my neighbors was $620. So I sent Monsanto a bill, $620. So I got an answer back from their lawyer. They said, we will not pay this because you would not agree to our release. And I said, okay. So I then went, here about 2 months ago, I went to small claims court. And the judge said, send Monsanto another notice and give them 10 days notice. And so I did that, and Monsanto refused to pay it. So a week ago, last Friday, the judge issued a summons against Monsanto to appear in court. It's not the issue here now. So it's $620. Oh, I forgot also $20 court fees. But anyway, in the court, I'm sorry, in small claims court, you don't have no examination discovery. You can get anybody or a corporation into court immediately. So now Monsanto now has to appear in court on the 6th or 7th of December. The issue here now is has very large implications for Monsanto because it's a liability issue. And if they lose on this one, you can imagine the thousands of farmers that will be going after farmers now, after Monsanto on the liability issue. So it's not the $620. It's the whole issue of liability. You've destroyed my ability, my choice, taken my choice away. So there's a liability issue here. So that's what it's all about. The organic farmers of Saskatchewan have a class action lawsuit against Monsanto on the liability issue because they no longer can raise organically soybeans or canola. Choice is taken away. They took Monsanto to court over 4 years ago. What did Monsanto do? Is that they said the organic farmers don't qualify as a class action lawsuit, and they're still not on the issue. They're still in court now, 4 years later, still on the issue whether they can qualify as a class action lawsuit. They're not back, they're not even to the area whether on the liability issue. Here I can get on a $620 bill, I can get Monsanto in court immediately. So on the liability issue. So that's where the case stands right now. But on the other hand, my wife and I had to make a decision. We know if I win, Monsanto's going to appeal it. Then it can go through the whole court system right up to the Supreme Court, even though it starts in the small claims court. That mainly means to us another 5, 6, 7 years of legal battle. I'm 70, I'm going to be 76 shortly, my wife will be 75. That means, like our lawyer said to us, you know what that means to you and your family? You're going to be in court yet when you're 80 years of age. But we feel that this is such an important issue that the rights of people be protected, especially farmers' right to be able to grow and use your own seed from year to year. So what are some of the other issues, important issues now, that have risen with the introduction of GMOs? To us, it's no longer what can happen or may happen, but what has happened with the introduction of GMOs. GMOs were given regulatory approval in both our countries in 1996 for principal crops: cotton, soybeans, corn or maize, and canola. And now we know what has happened. 11 years of GMOs. And everything, believe me, everything that Monsanto told us as farmers in 1996, when regulatory approval was given, turned out to be exactly the opposite. What about increased yields, they said? What about more nutritious? But most of all, they said less chemical use. And what has happened? It has now been found that the yields have gone down, especially in soybeans and canola. The nutritional content has gone down. But worst of all, the massive increased use of chemicals, more highly and more chemicals than we've ever had before, to control the new superweeds that have been developed with the introduction of GMOs. There has been no benefit, but all negatives. And I always remember some of the other things they said. Now we'd be able to feed a hungry world. Now we'd always have sustainable agriculture. And so now what has happened? Increased health costs, environmental damage with the massive increased use of chemicals. At least 3 times more chemical use than ever before with the introduction of GMOs. And these chemicals now, and the residue left by these chemicals, going from 17 parts per million now to 100 parts per million being allowed, and more toxic and more highly powerful is what has happened with the introduction of GMOs. There are many other issues, and I can only touch on a few tonight. But I do want to touch on what are we really fighting now at the present time on the northern plains and in many other countries of the world is the Terminator Gene. The Terminator Gene to me is the greatest assault on life as we ever have seen it on this face of this world or of this planet. And I don't know how many of you know, that's a name that we've given to it. It's really known as GERTS, but we call it the Terminator Gene, where basically it terminates the germination or all forms of life. It terminates the fertility or germination of it. So the gene is put into a seed, the seed becomes a plant, the plant produces a seed, and the seed is sterile. The danger of that is that it can cross-pollinate into your organic neighbor's crop, in your conventional neighbor's crop, and render all his seeds and plants sterile also. It doesn't stop there. It can be inserted into any higher life form, whether it's a bee, bird, animal, even a human being. Can you imagine corporations now coming out who call themselves life science, promoting nothing but death science? So again, it's the greatest assault on life as we've ever seen on the face of this planet. Now, what about the issues of contamination? What about the issues of coexistence? And I remember so well, and I just come back from Bavaria, where they are still saying you can have coexistence, where they're still saying that farmers can have choice, where they're still saying you can contain it. Believe me, there is no such thing as containment. You cannot contain a GMO once it's introduced in the environment. You can't control the wind, you can't control cross-pollination. Nature takes over. What about coexistence? GMO gene is the dominant gene, and it will take over whatever species or seeds of plants you put it into and render it GMO. There is no such thing as coexistence. You introduce GMOs into California or into your county, it's over. It's over. There is no turning back. It's there. It's like the Pandora's box. And then if you wanted to call it back, can it be recalled back out of the environment? And I've asked this question of scientists from all over the world that have done research, and they say at the present time they don't know if a new life form can ever be recalled back out of the environment. And then I asked the question, what would you recall back? Canola comes, for example, canola comes from the brassica family. And in that brassica family you have very many close cousins as well as distant cousins. Turnips, cauliflower, radishes, distant cousin like wild mustard, is already cross-pollinating into those close cousins as well as the distant cousin. University of Manitoba at Winnipeg has done many research, had done a lot of research and development on that, on the cross-pollination into close cousins. So now, again now, more crops that you cannot raise GMO-free, especially the organic farmers. And believe me, I have often thought organic farmers really don't realize how you can be wiped out overnight. My wife and I were wiped out of 50 years of research and development overnight because we were contaminated. And we have real reasons to believe, with the information that we've been gaining since that lawsuit was laid against us, and it was deliberately, because Monsanto wanted our seeds. But again now, as I said, what would you recall back when you have this contamination? Now, here in California, you can raise so many different crops and produce. and also with your vineyards. Remember, if you ever introduce GMOs, it will contaminate and destroy. A farmer now knows that if he grows GMOs, he will contaminate his neighbor. There is no insurance for a farmer who grows GMOs. If he contaminates his neighbor, it's his responsibility. Monsanto says a farmer knows they're not responsible. The governments, both governments have given regulatory approval. But at least one state, the state of Vermont, says if you contaminate, if a farmer grows it, Monsanto is responsible for the damage it does. So you do have one state in the U.S. that has taken a stand on it. So a farmer now knows if he grows it, he will contaminate his neighbor. Now, does that give anyone the right to grow a crop that he knows that will destroy his neighbor's ability to grow organically or conventionally? Now, here's another issue I think that should be very important to the people and the farmers here, gardeners here in California, the economic issue. In Canada, we can no longer sell 1 bushel of canola to the European Union and many other countries of the world. The economic issue has been devastating to our farmers. And who do we sell it to yet? We sell it to the United States, Mexico, and very little to other countries of the world. So we've lost our markets. The soybean issue to the American farmers, they've probably lost $300 million a year on loss of sales to the European Union. So again, the economic issue is a very, very big issue. Many, many other issues, and I won't touch too much on them, but we now have a lot of information on the health, on the danger to human health. And even Monsanto had to release to the British government in the last 6 or 7 months their own testing on glyphosate, or their chemical or herbicide Roundup. And so now we have really 2 things. We have the danger to the environment and human health from the massive increased use of glyphosate or Monsanto's herbicide Roundup, and then you have the GMOs themselves. And I'm not going to talk too much on that, but I just will say this. When you transfer a gene from one life form to another life form, you can never move that gene by itself. You have to use a promoter or vector. And what are those promoters or vectors? They're either a bacteria or a virus, and in the case of canola, an antibiotic-resistant marker gene. So besides eating a gene that prevents a plant from dying if you spray Roundup herbicide on, you are now eating a virus or a bacteria that was never in your food before. Then what about the issue of glyphosate? Monsanto's own releases and studies now have shown, first of all, a number of important things. It lowers a human's immune system. It also is a blood disruptor, which means it creates tumors, especially in growing organs, which means in our young people and babies. So those are some of the things that happen with the introduction of GMOs. I don't know what other areas that I would like to go into, but I think another important area is the whole area that you never ever hear about in the press. And that's the issue of control, intimidation, harassment. And if you look back, if you go to Monsanto's contracts, and I'll just go to the initial, briefly. Here's a contract from Monsanto. And a lot of people ask, why did farmers ever read or ever sign that contract? Well, basically the contract was on the back side of an order form, and they never ever read the contract. But briefly, farmer's not allowed to use his own seed again. He's always got to buy the chemical from Monsanto. He must pay Monsanto $15 an acre tech fee or license fee each year. He must permit Monsanto's police force to come on his land for 3 years after he signs his contract, even though he may only grow Monsanto's GMO canola or soybeans 1 year. And he also must sign a non-disclosure statement if he commits some violations of this contract. Monsanto can maybe take all of his crop, make him destroy his crop, and the farmer is not allowed to talk to anyone. He wouldn't be allowed to talk to you here tonight or to the press. So that is part of the contract. A new clause in the contract this year is that a farmer gives up his right to ever take Monsanto ever for the rest of his life to court. You cannot take Monsanto to court for whatever reason if you committed some infraction. That's just one thing. Here's another item from Monsanto. And it states on there here that if you think your neighbor is growing GMO canola or soybeans without a license, inform on your neighbor. In other words, rat or squeal on your neighbor. And if a farmer happens to do that to his neighbor for whatever reason, this is what happens. Monsanto immediately sends out 2 of their gene police. That's what we call them in the north, gene police. And they'll say to come to a farmer's home and say, we have this tip or rumor that you're growing GMO canola without a license. And a farmer will say, I'm an organic farmer. I'm a conventional farmer. I don't want to grow GMOs. And they'll say to a farmer, you're lying. If you don't confess, we're going to get you. We'll destroy you. You won't have a farmland. And this is what happens in many, many cases when these gene police leave a farmer's home. The farmer will say, was it this neighbor over here, or this neighbor that has caused me this trouble? So now you have this suspicion. Farmers not trusting one another. Farmers not talking to them. So now you have the breakdown of your rural social fabric. And I think that's one of the greatest things, that harm that has been done with the introduction of GMOs, is the breakdown of our rural social fabric. I often like to say is that my grandparents came from Europe around the 1890s, first in the United States, and my parents were both born in the United States and then moved up to Canada in the early 1900s. And my parents and grandparents had worked together with our neighbors to build our infrastructure, our schools, roads, hospitals, and so on. Now you have that breakdown of our rural social fabric. And I think that is one of the worst things, as I said before, that could happen with the introduction of GMOs. Those are some of the things that you never ever hear about with the introduction of GMOs. I have something else here. It's what we call extortion letters. We don't know how many thousands of these are sent out. But believe me, any farmer that possibly said something negative about Monsanto, every farmer that testified on my behalf at the trials got a letter from Monsanto. Briefly it says, we think you might be growing Monsanto's GMO soybeans, in this case canola, without a license. We estimate you're seeding 200 acres or have seeded 200 acres, 500 acres, whatever. Send us $200,000, $100,000 in 2 weeks' time, and we may or may not take you to court. Can you imagine the fear in a farm family? They get a letter from a multi-billion-dollar corporation, send us $100,000 in 2 weeks' time because we think you might be growing Monsanto's GMOs without a license. Another clause in it states you're not allowed to show this letter to anyone or we will fine you. So that is the other side of the introduction of GMOs. Do you want this here? And this is what has happened to us on the northern plains of the US and the prairies of Western Canada. I'm not talking about some third world country. This is what's happened to us here in North America. A complete control over our rights, our freedom of speech, our rights to use our own seed and develop our own seed, and eventually it will mean the total control of the food supply. My grandparents, as I said, left Europe 110 years ago. And why did they leave Europe? They left Europe because of the control of our barons and lords, and they couldn't own land. They came to America and Canada to start a new life. Now what is happening? 100 years later, full circle, not controlled by lords and barons anymore, but now by corporations. So this is what we are heading to, and we don't want this to happen. I should maybe just a few things more. You no longer have to sign a contract to be under the thumb of a corporation like Monsanto. If you are contaminated against your wishes, which has happened to us, you come under the same conditions as if you signed the contract, because you now have their GMOs on your land. My wife and I no longer can raise canola, because the trial judge ruled that if a farmer knows, or ought to know, that his soil or his seed is contaminated with Monsanto's GMOs, you violate the patent. In Canada, there is no pure canola seed left, no pure soybean seed left. It is now all contaminated with GMOs. I know that if I go to a seed house now and buy canola, it's contaminated with Monsanto's GMOs. I violate their patent if I grow any type of canola. And Monsanto, you can believe, will surely come after me because I know it is contaminated with their GMOs. So What else if that they don't even need a contract? This is from this year. Buying a bag of canola from Monsanto seed states right on the bag, by opening this bag, you can adhere to all of Monsanto's patent conditions. So they got you no matter how. So basically, it's taken choice away. You no longer have a choice. My wife and I have taken a very strong stand on this, and it has not been easy to fight a multi-billion-dollar corporation in court. The threats, the intimidation, the harassment, not only to our family, not only to my wife, but also to our neighbors. They would go to our neighbors and say, if you support Percy and Louise, we're going to get you and you won't have a farm left neither. And how would you feel if you had a Monsanto rep come up to you, my wife and myself, and shake his fist in your face and say, nobody stands up to Monsanto, we're going to get you and we're going to destroy you somehow. Phone calls, you better watch it, you're going to get it. We're going to get you. They'd come into our driveway, watch what my wife was doing for hours at a time. They'd watch us when we worked in our fields. That's what we had to go through. And when other neighbors and farmers hear what we've gone through, they just give up, they capitulate, because of the stress and the financial burden that they have to go through to fight Monsanto. As was said, we don't know how many farmers, how many thousands of farmers have just given in to Monsanto, but we do know that in the United States, with the Center for Food Safety in Washington, D.C. have documented 100 farmers from the U.S. that have settled with Monsanto, because once it goes through court, it becomes public knowledge. The average settlement by the American farmer on these 100 cases was $150,000 US dollars. One of the farmers was $2.4 million. It totally destroyed those farmers. So what does Monsanto say? We don't keep any of that money that we get from finding farmers. We give it all to charity. That's exactly what they said. So I wrote Monsanto and tell me the charities that you give it to. And I've never got an answer from you, Marty. So those are some of the things that you never hear about with the introduction of GMOs. But we have it for 11 years. And again, we're really fighting the Terminator gene and the cheater gene. The cheater gene is another gene that has been developed now. It works in conjunction with the Terminator gene. Both are put into a seed. The seed becomes a plant. But the plant now will not produce a seed unless you spray a chemical on it. That's the cheater gene. And when the cheater gene produces the seed, then the Terminator gene kicks in, renders the seed sterile. That gives them total control over our seed supply. Do we want this? That a corporation has total control of our seed supply. So those are some of the things that Louise and I had to go through. It was not easy, but believe me, we took a stand in 1998 that we would never ever give up. And we have 5 children. We have 5 children, we have 15 grandchildren, and this month we're expecting a great-grandchild. And so we look at what kind of a future do we want to leave to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Do we want to leave a future of land and air and soil, water full of poisons? I've come through 55 years of chemicals. I've seen the damage it has done. I've seen now what the increased use of chemicals have done. No, we don't want to leave a legacy of land, soil, and water full of poisons. We want to see these all without poisons. And that's why I'm here again in Berkeley to bring you this message. Don't give up. Stand up for your rights. Don't give up your freedom of speech, because Louise and I will go down fighting for the rights of people and farmers around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Percy. What we're going to do is just take 1 second and rearrange the stage here. I guess where I'd like to start is with Ignacio and ask him, you know, one of the things Percy mentions, we've been living with this technology, this new way of growing food for 10 years now. It is a tremendous experiment with the environment, with the food supply, and with agriculture. And I'm kind of curious from a scientific point of view, and those of you who don't know Ignacio should know that he is an associate professor here at Berkeley and a biologist, specifically a microbial ecologist. And you have looked at this issue of gene flow and the way genes don't seem to stay put. With this 10 years of experience, 11 years experience behind us, what do we know scientifically about these genes and how they move around?
Thank you, and I want to thank Percy for being here and giving such a moving and this is noisy.
Standing out. Standing in front of the speaker. Yeah. Stand in the middle here. Right now. Right. Come over here, Mr.
Yeah. Sorry, I have to stand up. Good evening, everybody. It's an important question. I think the idea of an experiment, and I have been caught actually, some of you have seen that movie where I've been caught saying that we're running an experiment in the environment, is wishful thinking. We wish we were running an experiment. When I run an experiment in the lab, I make sure that I label the tubes. I make sure that I have a control. I make sure that I know what to look for when the results come out, and so that I can know. And in reality, what we're doing is not an experiment. We're just doing a simple introduction of organisms that we really don't know how they behave in the environment. We know a lot about the chemistry. We know a lot about their molecular biology, but that's not the expertise that we need to develop to know what they do in the environment. We know a lot about what happens when we introduce a foreign organism into a new environment. We have very good experience with that, or very bad experience, depending on how you look at it. In California, we're experts on that. We know about Scotch broom, we know about zebra mussels, we know about sodden of death, we know the introduction of organisms that don't belong in a place, in a new environment, are problematic. So, from my point of view, an ecological perspective, we have been running this intervention with no idea of what we're doing. We just gave it the benefit of the doubt. You might ask, how would you ever do that? And the answer is not biological, the answer is political. There is a point where we needed, a historical point where we needed to have a replacement technology to replace computer technology, informatic technology, and material sciences as the main driver of the economy, and the Bush-Quell administration was told, this will be it, biotechnology will be it. By 2003, we had invested about $330 billion into this enterprise. So now, today, it's very difficult to call it back and say, whoops, sorry, it didn't work. So we engaged in this without really thinking of what the consequences would be, mostly in the idea that we would have a repeat of the computer sciences, the material sciences, the space travel, and all these things that were actually really successful. It doesn't work like that with biology. The other part of it is that we entered into it with the idea that having an intervention in the environment that ends up in a bad place is not something to be avoided. It's something to be sought, because problems, environmental risk, as long as you are on the ground floor, is a business opportunity. For some of you, entering a risk might be something to be avoided. For many out there in the world, especially the business world, entering risk, if you have the right the right tools, is something to be sought because it's a business opportunity. You mess up something, you have the tools to fix it, or at least you promise that you will have the tools to fix it. So that's what we hear from people who are promoting this. We did it. Yes, there are problems. Now give us more money, give us more time, give us the benefit of the doubt that you gave us back in the Bush-Quell administration, and we'll try to fix it. So it's not really an experiment. I think it's quite an interesting intervention. I, in my lab, try to use it as an experiment, you know, make the best of it by trying to produce maps and have some idea of how these things are moving. But it's not easy because they move by their own accord, by the rules of ecology, by the rules of inheritance that are out there that we barely understand.
Thank you, Ignacio. Why don't we just move the chairs down, and then you won't have that problem.
Then you'll be on the other.
Well, Percy, back to this question of how these genes move around. I'm curious to know what your best guess is, or about how those plants got into your field.
Well, first of all, back in 1997, when we first noticed it, and we seeded our crop in 1998, we know now that it came from direct seed movement. My neighbor had grown it, and another farmer that was close to me, within half a mile, had also grown it and had hauled GMO canola past our land. It first noticed in the ditch of the 1/4 section of land. Now Monsanto will say, and you'll hear them say, Percy Schmeiser seeded 1,030 acres of their, with their seed in 1998. I used my seed. I used 9,000 pounds of seed, and the University of Manitoba, in tests that they have done, estimated that the most of Monsanto seed that was in my 9,000 pounds of seed was 15 pounds. And yet they claimed total ownership of all my seed and said it was their seed, I seeded, and it was my seed from my land. So it came from direct seed movement back in 1997 and 1998.
So how small and light is a canola seed?
Well, I'll give you an example. It's something similar to an aphid. And we don't have aphids in Saskatchewan that can live over winter. They have to come in from South Dakota. If you have a wind for 2.5 days from the southeast, canola seed will blow as far as from South Dakota into Saskatchewan. So there is, as I said, no safe distance. You cannot control it. You can find sand from the Sahara Desert in Brazil and items from Japan and China in northern Saskatchewan. A little canola seed will go a long ways. There is no safe distance.
You said earlier that you thought that Monsanto took a particular interest in you because you were a breeder. I'm curious to know, to your best guess, how did you come to their attention? How did they know that this that their genes were on your property?
I have 2 miles of land that is along the main power corporation line or power line, and each year for the last 15 to 20 years, they pay a farmer to spray around the power poles and between the ditch and the rotolouds. And in 1997, after that was done, there were canola plants that did not die, and everything should have been dead. And so that's how it was first noticed. There was a few plants that had lived, and that field was part of the field that also seed was used from, because we were seed developers and we were using seed from 8 different parcels of land. And that's why the scientists from the University of Manitoba estimated that the most in my 9,000 pounds of seed was 10 to 15 pounds, and rate of contamination did not matter. The judge said they agreed I used my own seed, but it was contaminated. I should not have used my own seed. So
you collected seed from that one year, from 96 and 97.
Every year.
Every year, and then that contained the seeds from these ones growing in the ditch.
That's right.
And you planted them elsewhere in your property the following year.
And mixed with other seed from 8 other parcels of land.
I see.
As the seed developed, that's what was done.
Now, did somebody turn you in?
Yes, one of the gene police, a former RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who worked for Monsanto, and they get well paid for it, and that's what we call the gene police.
So does Monsanto pay a bounty for tips?
If anybody reports his neighbor to Monsanto, for whatever reason, two ways that Monsanto reimburses. Number one, they get a free leather jacket from Monsanto. Believe me, there's not many Monsanto leather jackets being worn in Western Canada or the United States. And the other way, they reimburse the farmer by chemicals. They never pay in cash, but with chemicals. In the trial, they even went to farmers. Monsanto's legal counsel went to farmers and offered two of my neighbors $20,000 worth of chemicals to say something that was not true about me, to try and discredit me. So they'll use every tactic possible. And basically that was one of the hardest things to face. And when they try and discredit you, when they try and ruin your reputation. I was a member of parliament in my province of Saskatchewan. And so I had a lot of people that had worked for me in campaigns. And so a lot of people came back to me and trusted me. But a lot of them said, Percy, you had to do something wrong. Monsanto would not do that to us as farmers. We are their customers. Well, a lot of those farmers found out a year later what Monsanto would do or wouldn't do.
Are these practices being pursued by Monsanto in the United States as well?
Yes, they are. I can give you farmers in North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana, and so on. And so it's continuing. It has not stopped. I have a letter that's not very old from a farmer where they come after him on 750 acres, and so it has not stopped.
I remember you mentioning once when we talked at another event that you used a term I'd never heard before, a Roundup bomb. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, a Monsanto's Roundup herbicide spray bomb. If they cannot find a farmer at home, and if they don't know a farmer's mailing address, they can go to the local municipality, or you call them county offices, and get a farmer's land location, and they'll use either a helicopter or a small plane, and they'll drop a Monsanto herbicide spray bomb, Roundup, onto a farmer's field, and it generally covers about 30 feet across, and then they'll come back 10 or 12 days later and check to see what has happened after they sprayed this herbicide spray bomb on this farmer's field. If the canola where they hit with this spray bomb, Roundup, hasn't died, they know the farmer was using Monsanto's GMO canola. If the canola has died, they know the farmer wasn't using Monsanto's GMO canola. So we don't know how many thousands of acres have been done, but they'll use, now it's totally illegal to do this, but you know, and they'll trespass. They'll go into any farmer's field they'll choose when it's flowering or when the farmer has seeded this crop, and trespass and go in and take samples, whether it's in the flowering stage, the plant stage, or the seed stage, and take samples. They'll even go into a farmer's air seeder, into a farmer's combine at night, and take samples of the grain to check on or do DNA testing. Now, that brings up an interesting point. Monsanto has a patent on a gene. Put the gene into a life form into another seed. There's about 30,000 other genes in the seed, other life form. What gives Monsanto the right to claim ownership by having insertion of one gene when there's 30,000 other genes? Now this leads to another legal battle. What about 3 companies that sell GMOs? And you have a farmer now ends up with 3 genes that are patented into one seed. Who owns? Does the farmer pay 3 fines? So these are all legal questions that now have to be answered.
You may not know the answer to this, but most of the precedents you've been describing are obviously applied to Canadian law and not to the United States law. Has there been a case that has reached a high enough court to set similar precedents in this country, or not? And if so, if not, why do you think Monsanto was so interested in making a precedent in Canada rather than the United States?
When Monsanto laid a lawsuit against me in 1998, there were 3 lawsuits launched. Once against a soybean farmer in North Dakota, and one against a corn farmer in Indiana. And basically the lawsuit was worded almost identically. They wanted to make an example of a farmer in Canada on canola, corn, and soybeans. And so there is cases, many cases in the United States. Now, the difference between Canadian patent law and American patent law is this. In the United States, you can have a patent on a seed or plant. in Canada, you cannot have a patent on a seed or plant. But what the Supreme Court did was a flip-flop. They said Monsanto's patent on the gene is valid, and whatever life form it gets into, they own and control that life form. So they don't have to have a patent on a seed or plant. All they have to do is have a patent on the gene. The gene gets into the seed, they own the seed, or they own the plant. And you have to remember that that gene is in every cell of the plant, whether it's a flower, whether it's a stem, whether it's a root, or whether it's the seed itself. So when cross-pollination, it will move into your neighbor's crop.
Ignacio.
I have several questions, of course, for Percy, but on this question, Percy, there's something that really bothers me, and I have tried to find the answer to this. Maybe you have it, maybe not. I've even asked the Center for Food Safety, who gave an amicus brief, I think, on your behalf, and I don't think I got a very good answer about it. The Supreme Court, the very same Supreme Court that ruled in your case, had just, not even a year before, ruled in the case of the so-called Harvard mouse,
Right.
where they said higher life forms are not patentable in Canada, therefore we're not going to honor the patent that Harvard has on this transgenically modified mouse. So for me it was very interesting to watch your case develop, because I asked the question with my students here. I said, okay, we're going to be watching and seeing what is a higher life form. Do you need to be visible? You know, I'm a microbial ecologist. I think about the microbes, the things that are invisible, as worthy. And yet, the Canadian Supreme Court seemed to be very focused on things that they call higher life forms. So simply out of biological interest, I was asking the question, what is a higher life form for them? Do you need to be a mammal? Do you need to be visible? Do you need to be, you know, have two eyes and be fuzzy and cute? What are they going to decide on in the case of a plant? So the ruling in your case was really puzzling for all of us down here, because in some way it was interpretable as the court saying plants are not a higher life form. Do you have a reading on it?
For those that don't know about the Harvard mouse cases, Harvard University came to Canada to get a patent on a mouse. They had put a gene in a mouse that made it more suitable for cancer research. So they came to the patent office in Canada and said, we want a patent, we invented the mouse. Really, that's exactly. And the patent office says, no, you cannot patent a higher life form or a mouse in Canada. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled, no, you cannot patent that higher life form. And they specified what a higher life form was, including a seed or plant. And so when my case came along, a short time later, we thought we had a sure case. Seed or plant is considered a higher life form. But in the meantime, I think I'll tell, there was one change of one judge in the Supreme Court. Had never been a judge before, came as a corporation lawyer from Toronto, was appointed to the Supreme Court, and it was a split decision 5-4 against me and for Monsanto. But what did how did they get around? They said if you have a patent on this gene, and the gene gets into any higher life form, including a seed or plant, that corporation owns that higher life form. So they did a complete flip-flop and said you can't patent a seed or plant or an animal or anything else, but if you have a gene that's patented and it gets into that life form by whatever means, they own that higher life form. In fact, my lawyer said in the Supreme Court, all right, you have 10 provinces in Canada. You can't have a patent on Canada that you own Canada. But now what they're saying, if you have a gene in each province of Saskatchewan, or every province of Canada, you do own Canada.
I think I follow you.
Not only you, but many others, especially in law classes.
You know, I first looked at this issue back in 1998 when I first wrote about it, and spent a lot of time with the people at Monsanto, and I had a wonderful opportunity to have access to them and their scientists and their labs. And the picture they painted back in 1998 was that they had these initial wave of crops, the Roundup ready crops, insecticide, the bacterial toxin that they'd engineered into it. But this was just the first wave, and within a couple of years we'd have, you know, many more wonders, including more nutritional plants, vaccines in potatoes, plants that could fix their own nitrogen, drought-resistant plants. I'm kind of struck at the fact is how much of that future has not come to pass, and that really the mainstays of the industry remain Roundup Ready, which has been perhaps the most successful GMO crop, and the BT crops. And this next generation doesn't seem to have quite materialized yet. I'd like to see if I could get Ignacio to talk a little bit about that great success story, the Roundup Ready trait, which, if you think about a trait being introduced to a great many different crops and spread over a great many different environments all over the world, is one of the more, you know, novel things that's happened in biology. And I wonder if you could talk about it a little bit in terms of what's going on in other parts of the world and where this Roundup Ready trait is taking us.
Yeah, well, it's such a huge field, actually, this specific one little trait. And I think it must be said, the Roundup resistance did not need to be achieved through genetic engineering or transgenic manipulation. There are other ways of getting to that point where you have plants that are resistant to that herbicide. It's interesting that they would be so insistent on the question that it would have to be a transgenic manipulation. And to me, with the benefit of time, now we are 30 years into this story, at least 10 years into the big commercial development of this story. With the benefit of that time, it seems to me that there's no question about it. These are not biologically or economically important things. What they are is, they are molecular brands that you become owner of that cow and its descendants. So that's, to me, the most important thing, to recognize that this is more than the biological implications of it or the agronomic implications of it. It is the ownership part that Percy has been so engaged with. That is the most important development here. We didn't need to have it as transgenic, but we do for the ownership part of it. Having said that, the trait itself really lends itself to very different agronomic practices. I need to tell people of what's going on in South America. The whole Amazon basin, ranging all the way from parts of Venezuela, certainly Brazil, some parts of Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, are known in the trade as the soy republic. And the soy all over again, once the Corn Belt fades away for whatever reason, the U.S. agriculture will fade away. We will have the soy republic to replace it, mostly to produce soybeans, and all these soybeans are coming in as herbicide-resistant beans. The agronomic practice of going after this is very interesting because you need just a machine that drills the seeds with fungicide and other chemicals into the ground directly, and then any other plant that wants to grow in the place, you just wipe out by applying the herbicide very, very widely. So it has brought with it a huge transformation that is really in the scale of the Green Revolution or higher, that I think is going to have massive repercussions in the way the environment works in the whole Amazon basin, as well as other places in the world. But I think the Amazon basin right now is a very interesting place where the rubber hits the road, and where this one manipulation is finding enormous economic, social. There are whole villages that are being set to fire, people evicted from their lands because they cannot afford to have the capital-intensive agriculture that comes with these drilled-in herbicide-resistant soybeans. I understand that some farmers in the U.S. are buying land and moving their operations down there. The whole legal practice of how this is happening and so on, it's just a huge geographical development, just brought in by this one specific trait. Really fascinating, really worrisome, really troubling about the environmental and social consequences of it.
I just want to ask one more question before I throw it open to your questions. And that is, given what you've said about GMOs, in terms of offering the farmer so little, not a gain in yield, at least, and a potential loss of yield with the Roundup Ready trait, the kind of intellectual property problems you've described so vividly. Yet, these plants, this business, you know, we've just seen the planting of the billionth acre of GMO crops in the world. Why in the world are farmers using them if they're as counter to their interests, as you've suggested?
That question has often been asked. Now we don't have a choice, and if you go back to Western Canada, a lot of the farmers have gone away now from GMO, they've gone now to hybrid canolas. But every bed of canola that we raise on the prairies is now contaminated with GMOs. We no longer have a choice. So everything basically is GMO in canola production or soybean production. So we don't have a choice no longer. Now, there was a point I primarily spoke about herbicide. You know, GMOs, plants that are tolerant to a certain herbicide like Monsanto's Roundup herbicide. But also there's the other GMOs, the BT toxin, where a toxin is put into a seed or into a plant and it will kill any insect that eats that particular plant or any part of that plant. And I think that is the worst part, or the worst type of GMOs that there are. The herbicides are bad enough, but let alone the ones that have the toxin in. Because every time you eat BT corn, BT potatoes, BT cotton, you're eating a toxin that you've never eaten before. And I think that's more deadly and more harmful to human health than the herbicide-tolerant crops.
Thank you. Ignacio, will you just answer the same question? Why do you think farmers have stuck by this technology, given the kinds of problems that we've heard?
Well, I'm not a farmer and I'm not an economist who follows these things in detail, so I don't have the numbers in my hand, but my limited experience, especially with people outside North America, is that it's exactly what Percy is saying, that it's not, people in the industry like to call these acceptance rates, and they show you curves of how people are planting more and more and more. There is a difference between acceptance and adoption. Adoption means they just have to do it. And usually it is because they have no choice, as Percy was saying. The seed companies have become more and more monopolized and more congregated around 3 or 4 of them. Little seed companies are not able to compete anymore. And the stocks in those large seed companies, those monopolies of seed production, are all contaminated. Either willfully or not, I don't know. But in many cases, the breeders themselves don't know that they're working with GMO lines. So they think, I'm working with this line and I want to introduce some other trait into to apply it in Western Africa or whatever. The line that they're working with is already genetically modified. It's not labeled that way. So we're back to the labeling question, the writing on the test tube, whether you're running an experiment or not. At some point, we made a decision, and I think it's a decision made here, that we were not going to consider these to be substantially different from other crops, that we were going to just label them and just feed them into the whole breeding system in the same way that we were running any other line. So we're having a massive contamination process through all kinds of different routes that nobody has control of and nobody has a choice over. Yeah.
I should just mention, what are the companies saying now? Like I said, in 1996, they said increased yields, less chemical use, more nutritious. Now what the corporations are saying is that it's a better tool for farmers to use to control weeds. That's the only thing that they're saying now, a better tool to control weeds. Believe me, for 50 years I didn't need Monsanto to control weeds.
Minutes left to take some questions, and before I start, 2 things. I'm going to pass around, for those of you who have not been to events at the journalism school, the night program runs regular events on these and other issues relating to science and the environment. And I have a sign-up sheet. If you just want to give us your name and email, you'll receive notice. If you filled out one of these at a previous event, please don't do it again. But anyway, pass that on. And before I start recognizing people for questions, I want to emphasize the word question. People have a lot they want to say on this issue. So, and I know this is a particular Berkeley malady. So please phrase what you have to say in the form of a question. Well, I think I don't have a portable mic, so why don't I call on people? And also, I urge you to speak loudly. And well, you should take it.
Okay, so
Question for either Percy or Ignacio.
whoever has an answer to this, I'm definitely interested. It's a question I've had for a while. And to start off with labeling, so from a consumer end, GMO products are not labeled, and the decision is that they are nothing new, the same food we've always been eating, so therefore don't require labeling. From a patent point of view, the whole idea behind a patent is it is something new that is open for ownership. So what am I missing, or how did that sort of contradiction come to be, and is there any way you see of sort of resolving that dilemma? Anyone who has an idea?
That's correct. You know, they, in Canada and the United States, they say it's substantially equivalent. And that's why you don't have to do any testing on it. Yet on the other hand, they put a patent on it that it is different. And that's another question that has been answered. Supreme Court has ruled that there are more questions now than there are answers. I should maybe just make a brief another comment. The Japanese School of Science have taken all the research that was supplied to both our governments on, especially on canola and soybeans. And they redid all the research and development in Japan, and submitted it to the Health Ministry of Japan. And this is what their findings are. All the documentation that was submitted by Monsanto to both our governments was falsified and was fraudulent. That's the School of Science report of the Health Ministry of Japan.
I think you're right to point to a very convenient version of reality. I mean, the fact that it's novel in one context and same old in another. And that is really the key to the development of this technology, that the government allowed them to have it both ways. The issue of labeling, though, speaks to the issue that Percy's been addressing of liability, and the suggestion that that is really the Achilles heel of this industry. And one theory as to why the industry has fought so hard against labeling is that if the food is unlabeled, if there ever is a health problem, if there ever is an allergy problem, it'll be impossible to do the epidemiology to tell that this person was eating this food with this construct in it and had this result. So and this is a point of view put forward by the Center for Food Safety, Andy Kimbrell, is that the lack of labeling is really a liability protection. In the back, if you could speak up and I'll try to repeat the question.
Okay. To me this looks like Canada has set itself up for an attack. If in fact farmers are becoming reluctant to farm and people are dependent upon food, this could very easily be as devastating to Canada as an invasion from the outside. So from a security point of view, I can see where the Parliament might want to challenge this. And the question is, what do you think of the speculation that I'm engaging in now?
Oh, that's a very slick maneuver. The question is, what do you think of the speculation I'm engaging in now? Do you have anything to say about that? Didn't work. A good point. Behind. Yeah.
Maybe Dr. Chappelle or Percy, you might know this, I've been wondering for a while. Is the Roundup Ready canola seed that Monsanto has, the gene that it has its patent in, is that the one that is also low linolenic acid producing? A low linolenic acid, an omega-3?
Yeah, the question is the Roundup gene that is in the canola the same as the low linoleic acid?
Low linolenic, which is the omega-3.
Pardon me, right.
Which is the short end of the...
Which has been put in what plant?
Well,
Canola.
I don't know that it has been biotechnologically added into the genome, but it has been selected for. And so when I read about that, I read it in separate places from where I read about the Roundup Ready, and I'm wondering, because that would be a nutritional disadvantage.
you know anything?
I don't know. It sounds to me like you're talking about a line, a very specific line that might or might not be crossbred with the herbicide resistance or BT expressing crop. Peggy, can you help me out?
The rabbit bread canola. I'm wondering if that's a low species of canola.
It's not. We have somebody here who knows better than I do, and she says it's not.
Yes, right up front.
This question is for Professor Ignacio. Earlier, Mr. Schmeiser mentioned what he called a Terminator technology, and I think it was GERT. And he was worried that it would cross-pollinate and sterilize adjacent crops. To my understanding, GERT is a male sterile plant that cannot produce its own pollen. So my question is twofold. How can a male sterile plant outcross into a neighbor's organic crop? And if not, would you, as an ecologist, support a technology that has a profound capacity to limit or prevent gene flow that, because it's such a problem as Mr. Schmeiser mentioned?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, because I think the general point is we denied for a long time that cross-pollination was a problem. When cross-pollination was proven to be right, I thought that was in kindergarten for me, but when eventually it was proven to be right in the environment, we recognized it as a problem. And then we came up with this idea, maybe these things called GERTs, which are genetic use or gene use restriction technologies, which were really originally thought as a way of preventing people from using the software, if you will. The metaphors there are really abundant for these things. Could we repackage it as a environmental protection technology? Could we use it as a way to reassure people that these things were not going to move out? It's separate from the male sterility factors, which are already available in hybrid crops. So there are several different factors, there are different elements in the genetics of plants, including the GERTs that are artificially constructed into them, that would prevent a plant from cross-pollinating. And this is now presented as an idea to how to restrict the movement of genetic engineering, now that we have recognized that this is a problem. The problem with that, and in principle, any application that relies on a biological application of it, is that anything you do to a plant, you're not talking about an individual, you're talking about a population. And anything you do to that population is a statistical manipulation. So you can say, for example, plant breeders make sure that there is for them it's enough to have the lack of cross-pollination at a rate of about 98%. They say, if there is less than 98% crossing, we're fine, we're keeping a line that is clean, that is generally clean. But what is that 2% doing? When you talk about enough time, enough space, and cartfuls, truckfuls, trainfuls of seeds, that 2% is a very significant amount. And if you're talking, like Percy was suggesting, of a trait that is actually enabling or giving a fitness advantage to the carrier, then you're introducing something that will increase itself in the environment for a long time. So anything that you do, including GERTs, is a statistical approach to the problem that will always be defeated by the force of the reproductive system of these plants. That even if it's 1% or 0.1% or 0.001% failure, that means reproduction. These are reproducing organisms that want to reproduce, that will figure ways to break through whatever you put in front of them to do it. And at this point, where you worry about that 0.001%, it is a problem. It might not be a problem for traditional breeding, but from my perspective, it is a serious problem that we should have considered before proposing this as a techno fix to a techno problem that we really didn't need to have in the first place.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was kind of horrified to hear about I think you call them Roundup bombs.
frankly, I was surprised the planes weren't shot out of the air, because I think where I'm from, they probably would have been. But I mean, clearly, if it's knocked out 30 feet of plants, it's pretty easy to see that something's happened. So what's happening from a law point of view? It can't be legal to drop bombs on someone's fields.
One particular case, I'll just give you just a brief account. Monsanto's people came to this lady's home, the farm lady, and they said they wanted to inspect her fields, and they had never bought Monsanto seed. And she told them that, and they said, we still want to inspect your fields, and he was quite insistent. And she did have a shotgun in the front entrance. And she told him that if he's not out of there in 2 seconds, he won't be walking, he'll be crawling. So that, we hope it doesn't get to that stage. But what happened then, a few days later, the plane came over their farmlands in 3/4 sections and sprayed. They notified immediately the Department of Environment and the Department of Agriculture, because one of the quarter sections of land was also being used for the water supply. So they were very concerned about that. The government agencies did come out. It was confirmed it was a Roundup herbicide that was used. Monsanto was notified, and it was a lady inspector for that particular region. She came out and she took tests also. A week later, she phoned the lady and said, it wasn't us that done it because you were not on the hit list. Exactly. So then they took it farther, and when the government agencies heard that Monsanto was involved, basically the case was dropped. That's exactly what happened. The farmer then went ahead and tried to trace it to himself. They found that the plane did come out of Alberta, the neighboring province. It was a third party that done it. Monsanto then said they weren't authorized to do it. It ended there.
Yes.
You spoke earlier about the global spread, or a little bit, and I appreciated that you began talking about Latin America and the global spread of GMOs. And I wondered if you might just say a little bit more about all the different venues of GMOs moving abroad. You mentioned especially large landowners using it, and obviously large landowners hooked into a global market already, etc. But could you say a little bit about, especially the huge number of really poor South Third World countries, and some of the venues from food aid, PL480 packages with agriculture advisors and extension agents, and right down through microcredit at micro levels. I'm sure you know plenty about those things in Africa, Latin America, and Asia.
I could attempt a little I don't know, approach to this question, because this is a mother lode of all of you who are interested in researching these questions. What Claudia Carr just asked is, I think, a really, really productive field of research, because nobody's doing this. Nobody's really asking these questions and actually deriving good literature and good numbers on what's happening. We know that USAID has explicitly forced high proportion of GMO aid grains. They call it grain, they don't call it seed. But for the developing world, there is no difference between grain and seed. Right. You eat what you plant, and you plant what you eat. So it arrives into these places. It's of course subsidized, paid and subsidized all the way to very small villages, and then planted there. We know that. But we also know that there is an incredible system of subsidies that has just recently been reinforced by philanthropic monies. The Gates Foundation is on it. Rockefeller is back on it, even though Rockefeller at some point about 10, 15 years ago recognized that all the problems that came with Green Revolution, they're on, and you can go to the website and find. They're not even calling it anything different. It's the Green Revolution for Africa. Now it's Africa's turn. That's the slogan. Now it's Africa's turn. It's happening in Latin America already. It's happening in Asia already. Now it's Africa's turn. So there are billions of dollars now being slowly channeled into this effort to promote. The way they put it is promote access, open the possibility for developing countries to have access to these enabling technologies and so on and so forth, just like it was before with water fertilizer, tractors, and so on and so forth, as you well know. So I'll stop there. It's an incredible field that I think would be fascinating to learn more about. We need a lot of research happening. There is a couple of commissions of students who have been in South America recently trying to retrieve some information about this. It's not easy to come by. This is all driven by State Department, not by agricultural economy. This is a question of national interest for us. So it's not easy information to come by. It's right here. It's happening in Berkeley. Berkeley is actually one of the most important nodes of this effort, and it would be really interesting to do research on it.
I should mention one item I did bring up is about contamination. The head of the Canadian Seed Growers Association, a person by the name of Dale Adolph, said there's so much opposition to the further introduction of any more new GMOs, like say wheat, rice, alfalfa, flax. He said the way we do this now is to contaminate. And he went on to say, and the Canadian Seed Growers Association is funded by Monsanto, he said the way we do this, and he said it's a hell of a thing to say, the way we do this is to take people's choice away by contamination. And when I was in South Africa not that long ago, in Johannesburg, a lady from BioAfrica said, with the introduction of GMO corn into South Africa, we'll not only be able to contaminate the country of South Africa in 4 years, we'll be able to contaminate the whole continent of Africa in 4 years. So the whole push now is to contaminate. You no longer have a choice. What has happened to us in Canada and the Northern Plains, no more choice in soybeans, no more choice in canola.
It's important to remember, though, that there has been a crop where the farmers in this country said no, and that was wheat. And Monsanto was about to introduce genetically modified wheat, and the wheat farmers of the Northern Plains said, please don't do this. This is going to ruin our markets. And Monsanto, at least for the time being, has withdrawn that. And that is a kind of high watermark, perhaps.
Terminator too.
And the Terminator too, they also withdrew, right?
Why can't they just contaminate, as he said? Why don't they just use contamination?
Well, you still have this issue of European markets, and if you contaminate the American wheat supply, you really hurt the, you eliminate sales for them. We have time for just a couple more questions. Yeah?
Is for Percy and Ignacio, and now you might know the audience, is Percy and I found out last week that Monsanto's is hosting their conference, their international conference in the town of Sonoma this week. And so it ends tomorrow, and we start tomorrow in the town of Sonoma. So, and Ignacio and Percy, please do share. We've had this tour planned since April with Ignacio and Percy. And for them to have their conference right 4 blocks from where we're hosting our dialogue makes a big input.
There's another question here.
I just want to follow up about the forthcoming GMO alfalfa, because there's a lot of implications. I think a lot of people don't quite understand with that. We import a couple million pounds of organic hemp seed, and our farmers grow alfalfa, with hemp or whatever organic crops that they're growing. And as soon as they say that there's only just a few areas where they grow alfalfa seeds, like in Oregon and British Columbia. And if they're successful doing that, that means most all organic crops are going to be contaminated. And what are people doing to stop that?
I think what has been done is we're putting a lot of pressure on our federal, especially the Canadian federal government, no more new introduction of GMOs. And especially if wheat was ever introduced, GMO wheat was ever introduced, it would totally destroy the organic farmers, because wheat comes from the grass family. On the issue of GMO wheat, when they tried to bring it in, it was found out that the Canadian government, and I don't know about the American government, was in bed with Monsanto, and the government of Canada would have got a royalty on every bushel of GMO wheat that was sold. So that's how now the Canadian government have disassociated themselves from Monsanto, and Monsanto said to the Canadian government, you can't do that, you still have a 2-year contract with us. But the government told Monsanto where to go.
Yes?
As a consumer, is there any way we can put Monsanto out of business?
question is, as a consumer, is there any way we can put Monsanto out of business?
Well, I think that pressure has to be put on our members of government that we want no more GMOs. And since 1996, there's been no GMOs introduced, so we've been able to stop it for 11 years. I was a member of Parliament at one time, and I think letter writing, individual letter writing to your member of Parliament has the greatest effect. If I got 1 or 2 letters when I was in government, it was 1 or 2 letters. But I'd start getting 50, 100, or 200 letters. Believe me, I brought it up in caucus. Otherwise, if you don't write to your members of Parliament, they'll say, well, there can't be much interest in it. I haven't received no letters on it. Letter writing has a big effect. Another thing that has happened in Canada, that all the mainline churches have really taken a strong stance against GMOs because you're talking about light. You're talking about control of light. And every November, there's a brochure that goes out almost across Canada by the mainline churches of the dangers of GMOs and the patent on light.
I'll just add one thing to that, which is that I mean, I agree with Percy, and I actually think letter writing is surprisingly powerful. I also think consumers have more power than they realize on a lot of these food issues. From what I've seen studying the food industry now for several years, is that it is one of the most touchy, responsive industries we have. And I'll tell you a brief story to illustrate this. Until 2000, I believe it was, McDonald's was selling genetically modified potatoes. New leaf potato, a potato engineered to have the Bt toxin and protected from the Colorado potato beetle. Monsanto did not introduce this crop until they had McDonald's approval. And they demonstrated to McDonald's with some research they'd cooked up that, I shouldn't say that, they conducted some marketing trials in Canada on a very small scale, saying that consumers had no objection to genetically modified potatoes. The reason this was so important is that McDonald's buys 7% of the US potato crop. So if they weren't on board, this product wasn't going to fly. They introduced this product and it was on the market for a couple of years. And then some publicity got out. The potato is kind of different than these other products because it really is a food that you eat rather than what canola is and GMO maize is and many of the other crops, which is to say an industrial raw material that gets turned into processed food or is fed to animals. Because most of these crops we're talking about, except for the canola, are fed to cattle. But as this came out, and there were a couple articles saying that, you know, you're wondering whether you've ever eaten GMOs. Well, if you've had a McDonald's French fry or you've had a Frito-Lay potato chip, you probably have. And this was news to a lot of people since it wasn't labeled and nobody ever made anything of it. And McDonald's began getting letters and calls from consumers. Not a great number of letters or calls. I don't know how many. I have heard from that in England, 25 letters or calls on the same subject that do not appear to have been organized is enough to get an item on the board of directors meeting at McDonald's. They're very nervous about food scares, what they would call food scares of any kind. So based on a very small number of letters, calls from consumers, McDonald's decided there's nothing in this for us. Selling these GMO potatoes really is just a risk. And there's no benefit to us. These potatoes they don't fry any better, they're no cheaper, they're no tastier. And they quietly withdrew their support for this crop. And this crop promptly failed. And it was withdrawn from the market from Monsanto. So there is one case of essentially a consumer campaign eliminated a GMO crop from the marketplace. So you know, I would not discount the ability of consumers to bring change about in this area. Yes?
My question is, like, the media plays a big part in kind of publicizing these sort of issues, and I was wondering, like, on NPR, they have so much funding from, like, ADM and, like, a lot of other companies that are biotech, and I was wondering, like, how does that speak on, like, freedom of whatever?
Well, the question is about why doesn't the media cover this better, and does it have anything to do with the fact that a lot of the funding for the media comes from, at least and certainly on public television and public radio, comes from the companies that are very intimately involved with this. I guess I'll take that one. I don't think the media has done a very good job on this issue, and they treated it as an old story from the day it started, which is a way of not covering something. I don't think, though, it is direct pressure from the industry that is responsible for that. You know, I can't speak for producers at NPR or public television who are backed by ADM and Cargill. But I think it has more to do with the way the American media works and the American political environment works. One of the most striking things about GMOs, and the reason that it is part of our lives now, is that both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, support it. The Republicans have supported it from the beginning. The Democrats, to the surprise of some, and if you go back and look at the Clinton administration, which, you know, these regulations came about just as we were changing administrations. Dan Quayle led up the regulatory effort on GMOs, and Gore was put in charge of it very quickly after he took office, and they made no changes. They accepted the basic doctrine of substantial equivalence, which you've heard a few times. That is to say, from a regulatory point of view, these substances aren't new enough to warrant any serious regulation. Why did the Democrats get on board? Well, it was part of the industrial policy early on. In the early 90s, there was an attempt on the part of the Democratic Party to pick out a couple industries to support. And biotech, as Ignacio was saying, was going to be the next computers. And that this was a time when many Americans were worried about our technological edge and our standing in the world economy. And biotechnology, it was decided in the highest councils of the Democratic Party, was something to put our support behind. The president of Monsanto, Robert Shapiro, was also very close to Clinton and served on various advisory groups. And so this doesn't sound like it has anything to do with the press, but it's just a fact of life in the American mainstream press that when both political parties agree on anything, there is not a lot of space for the press to operate. The mainstream press depends on being able to quote powerful people, politicians in both parties, to make a story. The press can't go out on a limb itself and say, we think this is a problem. They can only report politicians who think it's a problem, unless there is some disaster, a natural disaster of some kind. So you have this situation where the kind of circle of acceptable opinion in the mainstream press is determined by the political environment, and the political environment could not have been friendlier to this technology. So you really have to, yes, the media has let you down, but you have to realize that the Democratic Party has let you down as well if you object to this technology. That's just a fact of life. And it's unfortunate, but it's hard to imagine the press working in this country working in a different way. Miguel.
I can receive a question.
And this will be the last.
Well, it's not a question actually. I wanted to.
Remember the rule.
No, I think we should actually congratulate Percy for his courage. Campus should bestow on him the Berkeley Medal and his wife, obviously. It's not coincidence because he gave a very important message that we should defend academic freedom in this campus. And it's no coincidence that in the School of Journalism, we're debating these issues as opposed to the College of Natural Resources, which gets 80% of the funding from the Agricultural Experiment Station. There, they suppress this kind of research. And you know, some of the questions that came up here, for example, why is it that farmers are using this technology? Farmers are not using this technology. In Argentina, it tripled the area in soybean, in transgenic soybean, but 64,000 farmers went out of business. In this country, 194 farmers are going out of business every day because of economies of scale. In Argentina, you cannot afford the transgenic soybean if you don't have 500 hectares. That happened with the tomato harvester in California years ago that was sued because you could not be a tomato grower if you didn't have more than 140 acres. Okay? So there's economics of scale associated. There's no choice, and basically it's not that more farmers are adopting, there's a concentration of land which is associated with this technology. And this is nothing. In this College of Natural Resources, not only the research gets suppressed on alternatives, like the kind of research that NASA and others do, myself and agroecology, but also they're very much in bed with the very interest and economic interest that Percy is denouncing here, associated with the property, intellectual property rights, and that's nothing. You know, the Novartis deal, which you know very much about what happened with Ignacio. Now, British Petroleum probably will come to this campus, Beyond Petroleum they call it now, with a huge grant to promote what? Transgenic crops to grow biodiesel. So if you think it is a problem to grow food, transgenic food, think about the consequences of growing biodiesel, which is going to take, in order for you to replace in this country 15% of your oil, all the land of corn to biodiesel. Think about the consequence of soil degradation, the amount of pesticides are going to go, food security, and biodiversity degradation that's going to go ahead with this. So I think, you know, that we need to take into consideration the call that Percy did. We cannot lose academic freedom. We need to bring these debates constantly, not only here in the School of Journalism, but also to our campus in general, students, faculty, everybody concerned, the public, which this is your private university, because your public university, because the university is calling it publicly assisted, and in the way of privatization of the university. So we need to save this space for debating these issues, because we're not going to allow a bunch of corporations to define the future of the education and the research that goes on here. Thank you, Percy.
Thank you. It's a very important message, and this space will always be available to debate those issues. I want to thank Shauna Davis for... Okay, 1 second. And I will also, well, do that first.
I just want to make sure that if you know anyone up in Northern California, Percy, Luis, and Ignacio are coming to Sonoma, the town of Sonoma, and it's our fourth... No, Ignacio's not Sonoma, but Percy and Luis are. And then Ignacio will join us in Ukiah, and then we will head and close out the tour in Point Arena. And we chose Mendocino County to close because they were the first county to be the non-GMO free, and they're embracing us with full parties and dinners.
People want to hear today.
Thursday, oh gosh, the date. Thursday is in Sonoma at 6 o'clock doors, 7 o'clock. It's at Burlingame Hall on Spain Street. Friday is in Ukiah at the Mendocino Community College, 6 o'clock doors, 7 o'clock dialogue. Saturday is at the Manchester Point Arena Grange Hall, 6 o'clock doors, 7 o'clock dialogue. And thank you, Michael, for welcoming us.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank Ignacio for participating in his usual enlightening way, and Percy for his courage and his charm and his steadfastness. And we really appreciate your being here.